بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. We just finished talking about the issue of or the topic surrounding the matter of the conditions of prayer, and we mentioned the meanings, and now the author rahimahullah is moving on to mention the obligatory acts, the sunnah acts, and the mustahaba acts, yani the recommended acts or encouraged acts. And as we mentioned before, when we're talking about the obligatory acts, we're talking about those acts which are necessary to be present in order for the prayer to be sound, and the actions which are actually part of the prayer contrary to the conditions. We said that although the outcome is generally the same, that the difference between them is that the obligatory acts are part of the prayer itself, whereas the conditions of soundness are related to the prayer, but they are not part of the prayer. So the author goes on rahimahullah to say, Babu fara'id as-salati wa sunaniha wa fada'iliha wa makruhatiha. This is the chapter in which the obligatory acts of prayer and the sunnah acts and the fada'iliha and the virtuous acts wa makruhatiha and the disliked acts or discouraged acts will be discussed. So he goes on to mention the first section, which is the obligatory acts, and he says فَأَمَّا فَرَائِدُ الصَّلَاةِ فَثَلَاثَةَ عَشَرَةَ. The obligatory acts are 13. The first one he says is an-niyyatu. And what he means by an-niyyatu is the intention. And the intention, according to the Maliki method, has to be mu'ayyin. It has to be specific, meaning that the person has to have the intention that he's praying a specific prayer. For example, it is not sufficient for a person to say, for example, if he's going to pray dhuhr time, to go and pray have the intention of praying a fard prayer only. He has to have the intention that he's praying the fard of dhuhr, or the fard of asr, or the fard of maghrib, etc. Thus, it will not be sufficient for a person just to have the niyyah of performing a fard. So that's what the Maliki mentioned. An-niyyatu is to intend in the heart a specific prayer when performing the obligatory prayer. So that's what he means, an-niyyatu. Then he goes on to mention what takbiratul ihrami. What takbiratul ihrami means to enter the prayer by saying Allahu Akbar. And it does not necessarily have to, a person doesn't necessarily have to raise his hands, because we're going to read that raising your hands for the takbiratul ihram is a sunnah. So when we say takbiratul ihram, it means to say Allahu Akbar for a person who has the ability to speak. For a person who does not have the ability to speak, then the obligation is removed and they can simply enter the prayer with intention. So that's the second one, wa takbiratul ihrami. Then he mentions wal qiyamu laha. Wal qiyamu laha means wal qiyamu li ajliha, a standing for the sake of takbiratul ihram, meaning the saying of Allahu Akbar. Standing while saying Allahu Akbar is also an obligatory act. So that's what he means, wal qiyamu laha. Thus, if a person were to say his takbir while sitting and then stood up for the standing of Fatiha, technically speaking, his prayer would not be sound. Then he goes on to mention the next one, وَقِرَاءَةُ الْفَاتِحَةِ. Reading Surah Al-Fatiha is also obligatory, and thus a person should learn to make sure that they're reading their Fatiha properly by reciting to one who has knowledge of qira'ah, like a shaykh in Quran, in order to make sure that they're reading the Fatiha correctly, because it is obligatory. So here he mentions وَقِرَاءَةُ الْفَاتِحَةِ, and then the next one, وَالْقِيَامُ لَهَا. Just like it is obligatory to stand for the Takbiratul Ihram, it is obligatory to stand for the sake of reciting al-Fatihati. Thus, a person should make sure not to have the bad habit of going into ruku' while they're reading the last sentence of the Fatiha. Some people who are rushing in prayer find themselves during the last sentence of al-Fatiha bending over, going into ruku' because they're trying to hurry in their prayer. So قراءة الفاتحة والقيام لها, standing for it means standing for the entire Fatiha. Obviously for the person who has the ability to stand. Otherwise, a person who has been exempted from standing because he cannot stand up, meaning that he has to sit down for some type of disability, etc., then that person is exempted from standing. So what we're mentioning here in the text is the foundations. All of these rules, there are exceptions to the rules, obviously, like in any mas'ala of fiqh, any issue of fiqh, but what the basic text here is telling you is the general standard, or the original ruling under normal circumstances. Then he says, وَالرُّكُوعُ. وَالرُّكُوعُ means to go into the bending position after a person reads Surah Al-Fatiha. And technically speaking, the ruku' can be achieved simply by bending enough that if a person were to drop his hands down to the knees level, they would be even. So the best way obviously to make ruku' is to place your hands on your knees until your back, making your back completely straight. But in order to get, if we were just to look at the ruku', that is sufficient, meaning enough to say that I fulfilled the obligation of ruku', it would mean to bend your back enough that your hands could reach down to your knees. So وَالرُّكُوعُ, then the next one, وَالرَّفْعُ مِنْهُ. Raising up from ruku' is also an obligatory act. So after a person goes into ruku', when they raise up saying Sami Allahu liman hamida, that raising from the ruku' is also obligatory. Now a person might say, well, yes, it's obligatory, but how would it be assumed that anybody would miss it anyway? Most of these obligatory acts are the fruit of knowing the obligatory acts will become clear when a person learns more about sajda sahwu, meaning more about the prayer of, the prostration of forgetfulness, when a person forgets an obligatory element out of their prayer. For example, when a person, let's say a person was to go straight from ruku' into sujood by an accident, and then they weren't to realize until the next rak'ah. Now that they're in the next rak'ah, they realize that they missed an obligatory act in the previous rak'ah. That previous rak'ah will become invalid because it's missing an obligatory act. So that's just an example of how raising from ruku' could be left out of a rak'ah, and therefore the rak'ah would become invalid, and so a person would have to add another rak'ah at the end of their prayer, and that's a whole another issue. But just to highlight for you that it is possible that these things could be missed, and that all these things become clear when studying this section of prostrating out of forgetfulness, when one forgets something, or correcting the prayer when they miss an obligatory act. The next one is was sujood. Was sujood is also obligatory, and the obligation of sujood is fulfilled by placing the forehead on the ground. As long as the forehead is placed on the ground, Technically speaking, according to the Maliki, one has made sujood even if his nose does not touch the ground, although having the nose on the ground is one of the recommended acts. But technically speaking, for sujood means to place the forehead on the ground, even if the hands are not on the ground. Yani a person, technically speaking, will have fulfilled the obligation of sujood. وَالرَّفْعُ مِنْهُ, and raising up from sujood is also obligatory. Just like raising from ruku is obligatory, raising from the sujood is obligatory. And as I mentioned before, the fruit of this issue will become clear when if a person were to forget such a thing during prayer and then remember later on in the next rak'ah that he missed this obligatory act. وَالْجُلُوسُ مِنَ الْجَلْسَةِ الْأَخِيرَةِ بِقَدْرِ السَّلَامِ, the sitting position for the time that it takes a person to say Assalamu alaikum. What does that mean? The time that it takes you at the end of your prayer to say Assalamu alaikum, all of that, the time that it takes you to say Assalamu alaikum, that part of the sitting is obligatory. That's what he means by the sitting, the sitting in the last sitting, meaning the sitting that you're going to do in the last sitting, which is the fourth rak'ah, biqadr salam, the amount of time it takes you to say Assalamu alaikum. So once you say Assalamu alaikum, during that time that you're saying that is obligatory. The key to understand this point is simple. In order to know the ruling of the sitting, look at what's being done in the sitting. Whatever is being done in the sitting, the ruling of the sitting takes that same ruling. Example, Assalamu alaikum is obligatory, is one of the obligatory acts in the prayer, as we will see later. So during that time that it takes you to say Assalamu alaikum, that sitting is obligatory. When you're doing your tashahhud, that tashahhud is sunnah, and so during the time that you're doing the tashahhud, the sitting is sunnah. And when you're doing the salawat on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the salawat on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as we're going to see, is mustahab, or it's a fadila. So during the time that you're making the tashahhud, that sitting period is a fadila. So understand that point, inshaAllah. Next he moves on to wassalamu al-mu'arrafu bil-alafi wal-lami. What he means by that is saying the assalamu alaikum al-mu'arrafu bil-alafi wal-lam. In the Maliki school, in order for the prayer of the person to be sound, he must say assalamu alaikum. Understand assalamu alaikum, and meaning that he must make sure that he adds the as-salam, the alif lam, assalamu alaikum, and not salamun alaikum. So for the Maliki method, understand that we must say assalamu alaikum. That's obligatory for the Malikiyah, and that's what he means by wassalamu al-mu'arrafu bil-alafi wal-lam, that it has the definite article in front of it. وَتُمَأْنِينَةُ, as he mentions here, is the next obligatory act, and according to the Malikiyah, tuma'ninatu, which means to rest the limbs before moving into another action. So tuma'ninatu means to rest between the actions of the prayer. What does that mean? For example, when you go into ruku', you have to stay there at least enough time that the limbs are still, then you can move back to the standing position. When you go into sujood and you go back to the sitting position, you cannot peck like a chicken. Just raise your head up from the ground. Like people who are rushing in prayer, you see they put their head on the ground, they come back up, they sway back, and it's as if they don't even stop, and they just sway right back down into the second sujood. According to the Malikiyah, tuma'ninatu, resting between the actions is obligatory. So a person for example, a person raises his head from sujood, he must sit at least enough time that his limbs are still, then go back into sujood. So that's considered obligatory for the Malikiyah. Then we have al-i'tidal. Al-i'tidal means making sure the body, in general, means making sure the body is straight. But what do they mean by al-i'tidal? That when a person is standing in qiyam, that they're standing totally straight. Meaning, so after a person comes up from ruku', for example, they're in ruku' and they're coming back up to the standing position, they have to stand straight up before they can go down into sujood. Like I said before, some people like to rush. They're coming up from the ruku', and before they straighten out totally, they go back down and they go directly down into sujood because maybe they're in a rush. According to the Malikiya, a person would have missed the obligation of standing straight. Same thing with the sitting position. Coming up from the sitting position, a person has to make sure that he's directly straight up. For example, he can't come halfway up and then go right back down. So the tuma'ninatu wal i'tidal are pretty close, but between them is a slight difference. Because al-i'tidal is specific to sujood, making posturation, is specific to the sitting and the standing. Whereas tuma'ninatu includes every action, that there has to be a moment of stillness, whereas i'tidal deals with that there has to be straightness when a person is when a person raises from sujood to the sitting position, and when a person comes out of ruku' to the standing position, there has to be a moment of stillness. And so those are the obligatory acts that the author mentions, which are 13. And then he's going to move on to the sunnah acts.